Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and welcome to this episode of IPA Encounters with Professor Robert Toombs. I'll be talking to Robert on the topic of our history and our freedoms. I'm speaking to you live from the Baillie Maya Media Studio here at the IPA offices in Melbourne, and Robert is speaking to us from Cambridge. The IPA Encounters series is a series of conversations with some of Australia's and the world's very best thinkers, writers and commentators on freedom, our history and our culture. Let me say a few words about Professor Toombs. He is the Emeritus Professor of History at Cambridge University, and much of his writing and academic study has been on French history, European relations and Franco-British history. In 2014, his book, The English and Their History, was an international bestseller published to worldwide acclaim. Robert is a frequent commentator on the issues of history, our culture, Western civilization, and all of those aspects. Robert was also the leading academic voice in the debate for Brexit, in the debate for British democracy and sovereignty, and he's the co-editor of the pro-Brexit website Briefings for Brexit. In 2018, Robert and his wife Isabel were guests of the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia, and he and Dr. Bella Debrera, the director of our Foundations of Western Civilization program, gave sold-out lectures around the country on our history and on the importance of Western civilization. This year, Robert's book, This Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out of Europe, has just been published again to great acclaim. It explains the history of Brexit. It analyses what the Brexit vote meant, not just for British politics, but for democracy in the English-speaking world. Some of the topics we'll be talking about tonight include the significance of Brexit, as I mentioned, what is happening to our freedoms, what is happening to freedom of speech, what is happening to the rule of law, and most importantly, how do we recapture the spirit of tolerance, of equality, of freedom under the law that is one of the legacies of Western civilization. There are many questions from IPA members that have been sent in to us. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. We're going to get to as many as we can, and we have a number of video questions as well. Can I welcome you, Robert, to IPA Encounters? Thank you for what you do. It's a delight for you to be with us. And can I begin by asking you about one of the key themes of the Sovereign Isle, which is your explanation that the demand of the British people for democracy was not well understood by the media or by the political elites, which is why the Brexit vote was such a surprise. Could you explain to me what you think happened in Brexit and what it means?
I think the thing that most worried me and people who agreed with me, and I suppose when I say that it sounds awfully arrogant, after all it's the majority of the population, assumed that the vote would be decisive. That's what we were told after all, and that is what normally happens in a democracy. You have a vote with a majority, a clear, though small majority, but that's normally the case. And you expect then that the majority vote will be carried out. What we discovered to our, I think you could say our disquiet, and was that this was not necessarily going to happen, because the people who usually made the decisions did not agree with the vote that had taken place. Okay, this is not unique to Britain. We've seen it in other countries too. But then that they started to do their best to make sure that it would not in fact be carried out. Okay, you could say, well, nobody knew what Brexit meant. It could have meant all sorts of things. But clearly what it did mean was a reassertion of democratic sovereignty And what we had was quite a strong chorus of people saying that this was not the sort of thing that a democratic vote could decide, because people hadn't understood what they were doing. They were too ignorant, or they were too stupid, or they were too bigoted and backward to understand what was at stake, and they didn't really have the right to make a decision like that.
What does that say about the attitudes of politicians, the media, the public service to the views of the population?
Well, I suppose it means that they're used to people doing what they're told, to put it crudely. We've had referendums in the past, but this was the first one in which the majority went against the view of the political class, the media class, the opinion formers, the deciders, the people who had been to university, who were in parliament and so on, most of whom wanted us to stay in the EU for reasons that were never really, I think, wholly articulated. But the idea that people would vote against things that the elite, I don't mind calling it that, the elite had decided was right, was something that they found extremely difficult to accept. In fact, one of them, a very distinguished former politician whom I know and like, wrote saying it's as if people voted that the earth was flat. In other words, you simply can't use democracy to do things that are, in our view, stupid. And therefore, there have to be ways of getting round this vote, making it in some senses null and void. And that's really what we spent nearly 4 years trying to resist.
We'll go to some questions now. And our first question is from Dr. Bella Debrera, who, of course, you know well, Robert, and who is the Director of Foundations of Western Civilization program at the IPA.
Hello, Robert. It's so nice to see you again. My question is related to freedoms and Western civilization. So last time you were here in Australia in 2018, you gave a talk about how Western civilization is our future. Since then, as you may have seen on the news, our freedoms have been taken away from us by our politicians. And my question to you is, how do we get these freedoms back that weren't theirs to take in the first place without resorting to revolution or to civil disobedience?
Right. So that's a tough question, because I imagine you're thinking essentially about COVID restrictions, which I think have taken us all by surprise. I don't think any of us really thought that this sort of thing was possible. I have to say I'm a pretty weak need on this. It seems to me if once the pandemic is over, governments stop doing this kind of thing, we will not have too much to worry about. Of course, as we all know, governments like to keep the powers that they have acquired, and we shall have to be very careful about what they're allowed to do in future. I think there was probably never a golden age, especially in times of emergency, in which liberties were safe. One of our most distinguished lawyers, Jonathan Sumption, wrote recently that this had never happened before, and I wrote a review of his book, and I said, well, come off it more or less. What about the Second World War, when people were directed into jobs in which they were conscripted to go and fight, in which their food supply was rationed, civil liberties were entirely abolished, etc., etc. And this did not outlast the war. Will this outlast the pandemic? Well, I certainly hope not. And as far as Britain is concerned, we've always had quite draconian reserve powers in health matters. In the 19th century, I remember reading, one of my colleagues wrote a rather interesting article about health regulations in the 19th century. And he said in the 19th century, a local health officer had the right to enter your house at any time, ask about your bowel movements, confine you to your house or send you to a hospital. There were pretty stringent powers then, which were used in times of emergency. And I'm not too worried about emergency powers. As I say, the thing that is worrying if these become routine powers, and if the pandemic never ends, as it were. And there we all have to be very vigilant. And I think a lot of people are vigilant. And I think a lot of people, we've seen demonstrations in all countries against lockdown regulations. So I think politicians will probably think twice before trying to do this too often.
And of course, Robert, we had Jonathan Sumption as an earlier guest on Encounters. So
yes.
as I hear you speaking, it seems to me you're presenting a counter to the myth of the spirit of the blitz, that Britons are going to resist their hard-won freedoms being taken away. Here in Australia, there's been a lot of discussion about what has happened to the happy-go-lucky larrikin spirit that Australians thought we all were enthused with. And it sounds to me like you're saying that, in fact, there's always been in the UK some element of draconian, arbitrary emergency powers that a overzealous government is only too ready to exercise.
Well, I hope not. We shall see. I mean, we all admire the Australian larrikin spirit too, of course, and that's one reason why some of us have been so shocked at what Australia's been doing. Because, I mean, a lot of us have always thought, well, you know, we can always count on the Aussies to be sensible and tough, and in tough times we can rely on them. And then all of a sudden we find that you're locking yourselves down all the time. But I do remember the first time I ever came to Sydney, getting on a bus in Sydney and noticing there were, I counted them, there were 12 things that you were told you could not do. And I thought, this isn't quite the Australia I expected. It isn't, as you know, there is an aspect of Australian culture which is rather keen on regulating things and telling people what to do and what not to do. And maybe that's part of a common, you know, Anglosphere culture.
Do you think that is the idea, that people have willingly followed government restrictions and regulations, notwithstanding that in some circumstances those restrictions are quite ridiculous? Yes.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry to say I feel in two minds about this. On one hand, I'm not unhappy to live in a country in which a lot of people are willing to accept restrictions which they believe are in the common interest. So people saying, oh, you know, I must be vaccinated because we have to try and protect older people, or I wear a mask in the shop because I don't want to infect anyone. All that kind of thing seems to me good. And I'm not so sure I'd want to live in a country in which people say, I don't give a damn about anybody else. I'm going to do exactly what I please. And if I spread the virus, then that's just too bad. I mean, there is a good side to this conformity, which I suppose is a certain measure of common community feeling, trust in the authorities. You might say, well, maybe we shouldn't trust them, but we still do rather trust them. And I think, you know, a democracy has to have something like that if it's to work in a civilized way. The danger always is that these things are abused, and we certainly have in Britain a lot of people who like restrictions, who want restrictions, who are frightened of becoming unrestricted. And, you know, you see that when, you know, now I think we're pretty well clear that wearing masks out of doors is not a very useful thing to do. But in Cambridge, certainly you see plenty of people who are still doing it, although it's not required and indeed not useful. But somehow this has become a badge of rectitude, or perhaps indeed a sign of fear. But it's certainly not the case that we're desperate to get out of the restrictions. At least not everyone is.
Can we go now to our next question from David?
What modern phenomena do you think will be generally regarded in 25 years' time or so as quite absurd?
Oh, I think there are probably quite a few. My first thought is wind power generators, windmills. I think and hope that we will soon decide that these are a waste of time and money, a blot on the landscape, and don't actually contribute anything useful to global warming or our power needs. So I'd say that number one. But there's a lot of others.
Is there anything about politics and your keen study of politics in the context of Brexit that we'll look back on in 25 years' time and think, how could we have thought that? Why did we believe that at the time?
Well, I think and hope that people will say, why on earth did people get so worked up about Brexit? It was the obvious thing to do. The European Union was not working well. It was not a democratic system. It was failing politically and economically. So of course you would not want to be part of it. Why on earth did people make such a fuss? That's what I think, and I think that's what is likely to happen.
Is some of that fuss starting to die down as people are accepting the decision of Brexit and the transition?
Yes, it is to some extent. I think among people who were uncertain of their views, which of course quite a lot of people quite rightly were. They were told very different things, and many people voted to remain in the EU because they thought it was the safe option. The status quo always seems safer, even if it isn't necessarily safer. I think people like that have changed, and I think there's some proof in opinion polling that there is a greater majority now in favour of Brexit. But the sort of diehard Remainers have not really changed. And I think one reason is that, people like us who make a living out of expressing opinions in public don't like those opinions to be shown up as completely wrong. And therefore they're still, I think, arguing and hoping that they'll be proved right.
Can I now go to some questions that have been sent in? We have a question from Maureen. How long will it take for the existing woke orthodoxy in education to be replaced by something sensible?
Quite a few years, I think, because there's a pretty well-rooted woke establishment now, and they're not going to be easily shifted. And also the thing that most annoys me about this, and to some extent worries me, is how keen institutions have been to climb onto this bandwagon. I think often insincerely. Or perhaps institutions can't be sincere. But, this is in our interest. It looks good. It's good PR. It shields us from all sorts of other possible criticisms. So we have to go along with this. We've got a policy. We're that kind of sort of bureaucratic wokery, I think, is probably something that will change if the wind changes. But there are plenty of people who've got established positions now who are pretty wedded to this idea. I've got sort of involved in this, and I sometimes feel, is this a big battle worth fighting, or is it getting so absurd that it will soon collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? Some of the woke comments, statements, just seem so silly that it's tempting just to laugh at them and think, well, how could you be worried about something that's so silly? I mean, the latest, I don't know whether you'll have read about it, is in my own university at Cambridge, the classics, the museum attached to the classics faculty is worrying about its statues being too white. And as someone said, well, most Greeks and Romans were pretty white. There's not much you can do about that. And okay, that classics, they say, has been used to buttress colonialism, racism, and all the rest. But some aspects of this just make people laugh. They annoy them, but also they regard them as ridiculous. And if that continues, then I think the tide might change. But I think somebody has to stand up against this and point out the absurdity of it, because it hasn't got much public support. I think probably in Australia either. It has a small, very active and vocal minority. It has, cowardly institutions, but I think public opinion finds this either mystifying or annoying or ridiculous.
And public opinion was certainly crystallised as statues were being demolished and taken down. And a few days ago, you wrote a wonderful piece in the Telegraph in the UK about the Newcastle Town Council providing a suitable interpretation to a memorial to men who died in the Boer War. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a lovely case study of exactly what we're confronting and exactly how people don't know history.
Yes. Though I should say I had a rather nice email from a local councillor in Newcastle saying, don't worry, we're not going to do anything too stupid, more or less. You're the first to know this. So I'm not. But yes, I think what tends to happen is that local authorities get someone approaching them and saying, you've got all sorts of racist statues and memorials in your town, you better do something about it, otherwise there's going to be trouble. And then they sort of set up a survey and they think, okay, we'll have to explain these things. So in the case of the Boer War Memorial, I thought I would just provide a slightly provocative explanation that I said they were very welcome to use if they wanted to, which was showing that the Boer War was not an obvious case of the racist British Empire crushing, the forces of liberty. It was in fact a rather complex conflict in which the Boers were in fact the racists, and the British Empire was arguably on the side of progress and enlightenment. And but of course, this is not the message that people, or at least that activists want to hear. They're not, I think, not really very interested in history. They're interested in using history as a means of propaganda, and I think stirring up dissension, making people feel ashamed or feel unhappy about what they thought was a history that they could be proud of, and they're being told, no, this is not something to be proud of. It was wicked. Your society is racist. You have to do something about it.
How do we explain that, as you've written eloquently, history is not to be used for propaganda purposes, that history is complex and complicated and has subtleties, and Western civilization has good things and bad things? How is that explained to the public? Because history is now taught as something that's black and white.
Well, it's often not taught at all. That's our problem, and maybe yours too. I mean, very few children, in fact, I think in Britain, doing some history, and that's not very much history, is only compulsory up to the age of 13. Very few students at school, and of course a tiny number at university, do history in any depth. So people get their ideas of history on the whole from films, television programs, what they read in the newspapers, and books they themselves buy. It's not something that's taught very much at all, and the British Empire is taught hardly at all. Now, I've forgotten your question now. I was getting so excited about on this subject.
How do we explain the complexities of history?
Yeah. I mean, I think and believe that most people are quite willing to be told what happened. The Boer War, never heard of it. What on earth was that? And someone can tell them. But then, of course, that means that the someone is quite important, because they're not going to be necessarily able to judge whether what they're being told is reliable or whether it's propaganda. I mean, history's always been used as propaganda. And I think what, in a sense, has given woke history an opportunity is a certain postmodern attitude to truth and scholarship, which particularly affects the humanities. So in history, we're told that there's nothing that's really true. There are just lots of competing stories, narratives, and it all depends on where you're coming from. So there's my truth and there's your truth, and that therefore I can impose my story on you, because my story is the moral story or the modern story, and your story is a racist story or whatever. I think, most historians would say, well, actually, there are lots of things in history that are true and that can be proved to be true, and that we want to tell people what these things are. History is not simply a story. It's based on provable fact. But that's what many postmodern scholars, in a sense, find, I think, difficult to accept. And it's one reason why much of the woke activism, when it concerns the past, does not come from historians. It often comes from, specialists in post-colonial literature and so on, for whom it really is just a lot of different stories. And I think historians have to say, well, this is what the evidence tells us. We have evidence, we can analyze the evidence, and this is what we can say is true. And what you say is actually not true. And I think that's what we need to do.
And you were telling me earlier, before we commence this discussion, about a very exciting initiative in exactly this regard, whereby some historians are coming together to talk about exactly these things. Could you share some of that with us?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. Well, it's a group. We decided to call ourselves History Reclaimed, and it's a group of about 40 historians, mainly university academics, from 7 countries, several ethnicities, who basically agree with, as you were saying earlier, that history is something that needs to be explained and is not simply something that you can use in any way you like to put across any political message you choose. It's something that does have a truth, and we want we're going to get together to try to put forward this information, to give the public this information. So we're going to have a website called History Reclaimed, and Bella, whom we saw earlier, is a member of this group. And we hope it will have some influence, that people will find it of interest across the English-speaking world and perhaps beyond. But we have Canadian, American, New Zealand, Australian, Irish and British historians who are all involved in this group.
And what has been the response of historians as you've spoken to them about this? Do historians understand what is happening to their discipline, or as you said earlier, are many surviving this through gritted teeth?
Oh, I think many are, and I think. Well, I said earlier, I was having my whinge about institutions, but in great universities like Cambridge and Oxford, this policy is more or less being imposed. Faculties are being told that this is the university's policy. Decolonizing the curriculum is the university's policy. What are you going to do about it? We want to report on what you're doing. And this is being put forward, as I said earlier, I would say essentially for PR reasons, by university administrators who are not academics. And I think often it is being received with alarm and despondency by academics, but who, academics are not on the whole a very combative lot. They want to be allowed to get on with their research. And I think in many cases they will go along with this and say, let's try and make it as least bad as we can. But there's nothing we can do, we've got to do it, and so let's do it in a painless kind of way. I think a lot of it's that.
Can I go to another question before our video question? So this is a question, Robert, from Father James Grant. We are witnessing the slow decline of Christian faith in Australia. What suggestions would you make to Christian leaders to reverse this situation?
Well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to give advice, except as a friendly observer, as it were. And I don't think I can give advice to Australian Christians. I think what's happening in this country, in Britain, is that the established church, the Church of England, is becoming more detached from its grassroots. Okay, many of its grassroots are elderly people living in small communities. They look after their local church. The church is a center of the community life, but the church institution seems less and less interested in this, and it seems to be becoming a much more top-down organization. That's what its critics say. And I think one thing that shocked me, and I think shocked other people during the pandemic, was that the Church of England simply acquiesced in having all its churches closed pretty well indefinitely. They're reopened now, but for a long time you couldn't set foot in a church. And I think this seemed to me to show a kind of abdication. During the Black Death, I don't think you had the church saying, "Oh well, let's keep well out of the way till it's gone away." The church has a duty, and I think it needs to be more active at the grassroots. But sorry, that's a very obvious thing to say, and I apologize to Christians in the audience for such an inadequate view. But I think the church, the established church in this country, has, I think, suffered a very serious blow during the pandemic, and I'm afraid largely because of its own leadership.
And Robert, that is certainly the case here in Australia, as many religious leaders of many denominations have not spoken out about the restrictions that have been imposed on religious services in this country, whereas you can do many other things as we've been locked down, but you can't go to a synagogue or a church or a mosque.
Yes.
Can we go one further question before our next video question? This is from Peter. Robert, is liberal democracy around the world in a crisis? And if it is, can it survive the crisis?
Well, I think it clearly is in a crisis. We see that after all, the great liberal power, the United States, has clearly been in a political crisis for some years. A worse one now than I can ever remember it being in. I think at least one thing occurs to me is that we're no longer in the ascendant. If you take the world as a whole, the values of Western liberalism, if you like, which are largely the values of the Christian tradition, somehow amalgamated with many of the ideas of the Enlightenment about rational inquiry, science, personal freedom, freedom of speech, all those things that we thought we could take for granted, and which we also thought the rest of the world was moving towards. And indeed, it was moving towards. It appeared to be moving towards very decisively in the 1980s. And now all of a sudden we realize that the rest of the world is, and I would say for the first time for several centuries, not moving in a Western direction. China, India, the Islamic world are not Westernizing. Indeed, they're enemies of, or at best indifferent to, Western ideas. And it seems to me that's the first time that's been true, certainly since the 18th century. So how do we cope with that? Well, foretelling the future is a mug's game. But I think the liberal democratic states really have to look at themselves and also have to learn to rely much more on each other. We've been rather naive about the world. We've been expecting, as we have for a long time, that somehow the forces of progress as we see them would prevail. That's no longer clearly true. Now, will we survive? Well, I still believe that liberalism is the best and most resilient system. Partly because and this was said by the French philosopher Montesquieu in the 18th century when he was talking about England, because it's able to correct its own mistakes. The thing about systems that are not democratic is that they don't correct their mistakes. They tend to double down on their mistakes. And I think we're bound to see that in China over the next few years. However strong it seems now, it has a system which is concentrated on one person who's bound to be getting older. The system is rigid. We've seen that before. How can it cope with an expanding society? So I think we can adapt. They can't. And I think the reason for much of the conflict in the world and the attacks on Western liberalism is not because of our weakness, but in a sense because of our strength, because we're a threat. Our ideas are still a threat to those parts of the world that don't adopt them. I'm not saying that in every way the West is the best, but I do think that many of the ideas that we have come up with are the ones that best serve human flourishing. And I think many people see that. You only have to look at the scenes at Kabul airport to know that people are not rushing to live under the Taliban. They're not rushing to Hong Kong to live under the Chinese. They really want to live in a society which gives them freedom, and that's what we can still do, unless we damage our own freedoms by our own stupidity, cowardice, bigotry. And that's the sort of thing that we've been talking about. So the dangers, I think the worst dangers really come from within. And if we trash our own values, we can't really expect other people to respect them. And I think we've done a lot too much trashing in recent years.
Can we go to our final video question from Lyle, which touches on many of the things you've just spoken about, Robert?
Well, Robert, thank you so much for that today. My question is, how do you see the battle for civilization playing out over the next 20 years or so?
Wow. well, historians don't like telling the future because, and we always say that, but it's always because you know that history is full of surprises. You know, people who try to tell you what's going to happen over the next 20 years are almost always wrong. I remember a well-known book that was published in 1913 saying that the era of war between states was now over. And then, of course, a year later, the First World War began. So what do I think should happen, let's say? I think we have to, all the democratic nations have to look to their own cohesion. They have to look at their own political systems and why they've been, in some senses, failing. Now, I don't believe they've been catastrophically failing. We have to do our best to maintain free speech, because that's the way we can correct our mistakes. So I think we've got to look to ourselves first. And that also means things like protecting our economies, protecting our intellectual property, not allowing ourselves to be pillaged, not allowing ourselves to be pushed around. This is a very conservative view, which I don't apologize for. And because I still think the democratic nation state is the strongest form of government. We have to defend ourselves against internal enemies, some often quite well-meaning ones, to make sure that our own countries work as well as they can, and we need to work on the relations between democracies. You know, people are at least paying lip service to that now and saying we need a greater, a global alliance of democracies. Well, I'm sure we do, and that's something that Australia and Britain can necessarily take part in. Whether we have we must all hope that will mean that the world can continue in peace, relative peace, as it has since 1945, without wars between the great powers. But that depends to a large extent on China, I think, and on our ability to show China that that aggression is not going to pay dividends. And I think the problem, if I'm rambling a bit now, but I think the problem is often when countries mistake the intentions of others. When a country thinks it will have a walkover because its enemies or its opponents are too weak to resist, and then finds out too late that they are going to resist. You might say that wars only ever happen when there is a misunderstanding of the other side's intentions. So I think we have to make our intentions pretty clear, and we have to be pretty firm about it in a non-aggressive way. And I hope that will make us as safe as it's possible to be in the world. But I think we're in for a time of turbulence. We haven't even mentioned climate change and all that goes along with that, which is potentially, of course, very damaging to us, potentially a lot less damaging to China, which doesn't seem to be too worried about it. But we have an awful lot of problems. I mean, I think I've probably lived through one of the best times in the whole of human history. And it may be that really good time is coming to an end. I hope not. But the only way we can prevent it is looking to our own political systems, our own societies, our own intellectual abilities.
And mounting the arguments about the benefits of liberal democracy and the benefits of freedom. And in the few minutes that we have left, Robert, I just wanted to ask you a few last questions. In the essay that you wrote following your visit to us in 2018, Why Western Civilization is Our Future, you wrote about the importance of tolerance and freedom of speech, and you just identified freedom of speech as the means of correcting our mistakes. And you said that freedom of speech, tolerance, the rule of law, these are the legacy of Western civilization that have created the culture that we have enjoyed. How does one make the argument for freedom of speech?
In a way, it shouldn't be very difficult. In a way, I don't think it is. I think most people accept that freedom of speech is a good thing. And we have, at least in Britain now, we have a government that seems to agree and is taking steps to protect it. But I think the danger is, as we've seen, of people who are trying to cast freedom of speech as a tool of oppression. Okay, that's a difficult argument to make. I don't mind arguing against that point of view. That's easy, and indeed our argument is easy. But it's the power of intimidation, often through social media, that scares a lot of people. And what I think in some senses is more insidious is self-censorship. People will not say things that they think might get them into trouble. And that kind of self-censorship, I think, has become almost second nature in many liberal countries. You could say, well, it's in areas which don't matter all that much. You know, what matters for our future is arguably science and technology, or at least that's going to keep us out of serious trouble, we hope. And that is not so much affected, clearly, by, decolonizing curriculum and all that. Though you might say, at least having said that, I suppose I'd have to say, well, how much of the climate change debate is affected by what is thought to be sayable and not sayable? Is it really a true debate or a free debate? I'm not so sure. So perhaps I'm wrong about that. I think perhaps there is a serious danger. And the danger is of a whole system being created by which certain things are thought to be unsayable. And the penalties for saying them are, in a sense, being ostracized by losing your job, by losing your research funding, it might be. And I think we have to rely on people being willing to speak up and say, I don't agree with this, this is wrong, this is not true. That's all we can do, and that's all we can really hope for.
A final two questions, Robert. One of the themes that many IPA members asked about is the teaching of history. And this question from Louisa is our second last question, and it's in two parts. Robert, what advice would you give to a young person wanting to study history? And the second part is, what advice would you give to a young person wanting to become a history teacher?
Well, I think my first advice would be don't believe anything on trust. Okay, maybe that's not a very nice thing to say, but history is a lot of history is about argument. Don't assume that what you're being told is right. What historians do is, as all scientists do, is constantly try to criticize and reflect on whether what has been said is true. And so I think and you might say one of the reasons to study history is to teach yourself the habits of being critical and not accepting the orthodox story. So that's the first thing I would say. And for teachers, I would say the same. What you're trying to do, well, I suppose there are a number of things you'd be trying to do. One is to, and maybe these things are in some tension. One is to teach children to question what they're told. But the other, I think, and this is rather unfashionable, is to teach them to have some sense of pride in and confidence in the society in which they live. And if that's a democratic society, it seems to me all the more important. So I'm not saying that teachers should use history as a form of patriotic propaganda, but I'm pretty sure they shouldn't use it as a form of unpatriotic propaganda, which is what often seems to happen, because undermining children's sense of belonging to their community seems to me not to be in anyone's interest.
And a final question from Mary for this session of IPA Encounters, and you've touched on some aspects of this question. Can you please ask Robert what he is optimistic about for the future?
Okay. I think I'm optimistic that democratic countries will realize that one of the big questions they have to face is not whether the climate is changing, but what you can sensibly do about it, as opposed to adopting sort of quasi-religious gestures to placate the gods of the climate. which seems to me what we've been largely doing, at least in Europe. So I hope we shall have governments that will say, what we need to do is build more nuclear power stations, not more wind farms, and sensibly look at how we reduce emissions, and also try to make sure that China does it too, and if necessary, by trade measures against Chinese exports. So I would be optimistic if I thought that would be done. But I think that maybe the reality of the situation will force it sooner or later, but later is not good.
Robert, can I thank you for a wonderful discussion today? Can I thank you for all of your support and encouragement for our culture of freedom? We look forward to your very exciting initiative, and we hope that we can see you in Australia before too long. Thank you for being with us today on IPA Encounters.
Well, thank you for asking me, John. It's been a pleasure. And all the best to IPA.
Thank you for watching this edition of IPA Encounters with Professor Robert Toombs. On the 21st of September, our next guest will be Distinguished Fellow at the IPA and former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott. You can join the on-live discussion by becoming an IPA member at ipa.org.au/join encounters.